The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you wish to participate in the program, tune in at 5 p.m. every Wednesday for A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio. 96.9 FM here in Baton Rouge. And if I sounded like I was smiling there while I was speaking, I was. It just occurred to me while I was saying that, Lang, that I wasn't even thinking about what I was saying. And it's just coming out. I guess that means I'm a professional. Anyway, this is a live call-in show. 343-9927 is the number to call. 343-9927 to call in and offer your perspectives or questions or challenges on the topic of the evening. And before I go any further regarding the topic, I'd like to welcome my faithful co-host, Lang Baker. Lang, good to have you with me.
Howdy, Wayne. Good to be here.
Us. Okay, so just to be accurate with last week's promo with this evening's topic, tonight we're talking about freedom. Just what does that word mean? And what limits can be placed upon us while we still consider ourselves as being free? And I found lots of stuff. And of course, having been a right-wing nut job in my not-so-distant past, about 20 years ago, I guess, I have a lot of opinions, or had a lot of opinions, and I was darn sure of them regarding what freedom was. But let's start with the Wikipedia definition of freedom. Generally, freedom, it said here, is having an ability to act or change without constraint. And of course, my first thought was, well, change what? But we'll get to that. Later on in the same page, it stated that John Stuart Mill differentiated liberty from freedom, in that freedom is primarily, if not exclusively, the ability to do as one wills and what one has the power to do, whereas liberty concerns the absence of arbitrary constraints and takes into account the rights of all involved. And that was the first big question I thought of, Lang, was what other rights? What rights of everyone else involved? I mean, are there certain things that we all have a right to? That seems to be the crux of the issue as far as what constitutes a legitimate restriction on one's actions, wouldn't you say?
I think perhaps what it was getting at is that we respect others' equal entitlement to whatever rights we assert for ourselves.
Okay, so if somebody doesn't assert the right to drink alcohol for themselves, they can restrict me from drinking beer or wine, or...
Well, I suppose that's going to get down to how narrowly or broadly you describe what the right is.
Yeah.
Like...
Okay, I guess we first should... I'm thinking here, there are different environments we need to consider too, environmental limits. If you're sitting off in the woods all by yourself, you pretty much have a right to do whatever you want out there by yourself, a la Ted Kaczynski, although he was mailing bombs to people too. But aside from that, but I mean, if you are not involved in a community, then you are not constrained by anything except maybe nature.
Yeah, there are some philosophers who have stated that if you live in nature, your freedoms are limited by what the laws of nature are.
Right.
And if you're living in society, your freedoms are described and limited by what the laws of that society are.
Okay.
It's kind of like the social contract theory of freedoms and liberty.
Okay. And by virtue of living in a community, you accept certain rights for others. That gets us right back down to what rights do others have.
Yeah, well, that will probably depend on the community and what particular social contract that community is living under. Like the rights you have in, say, in Islamic, a fundamentalist Islamic society would be different than the rights you have in, say, hippie commune.
Okay, but I don't recall signing any contract though.
No, a social contract doesn't imply a written contract. It's what the understanding is within
Right,
that
of
society.
course, of course. Okay, well,
And the idea of liberty there is that everyone is entitled to the same rights, whereas some societies don't have that kind of structure. It's like
Okay.
there's a hierarchy where some people have more rights or privileges than other people within that society. For instance, the slave in a society that has slavery, the slaves don't have the rights
right,
that the slave owners have.
but they're not really a part of that society,
well,
though.
They aren't a part of that role within that society that the slave owners are. You could say, that they're all one society because they're all engaged in activities that have an impact on one another.
Okay, well, and thinking of that, then, and also thinking back to one of the quotes you mentioned before we went on the air: "If all are not free, none are free." And so, is America, given the history of racial discrimination in this country, slavery, racial discrimination, and the like, are we a free society now? And I realize I'm risking getting us off on a tangent here, but
Yeah, well, I was reading through a collection of quotes about freedom, and there were a number of different themes that different quotes were relevant to one theme and others to different themes. And the idea that all must be free for any to be free was one theme that came up in a number of the quotes. And a couple of folks who made or quoted along that line, on one hand you've got John Kennedy, freedom is indivisible, and when one man is enslaved, all are not free. But then you've got Eugene Debs, while there is a soul in prison, I am not free. And I don't think that many people would put John Kennedy and Eugene Debs in the same
no
category
Eugene,
as social theorists, but
No.
they both had a similar proposition here about what freedom is with respect to whether everyone has to be free in order.
Yeah, and I
to be free.
always took Eugene Debs's statement to that effect to mean that so long as there was one soul in prison. I guess I'm thinking he was the labor leader, and I associated that with him talking about labor.
Yeah, this was a statement he made in court in 1918.
Right.
He
But
was thrown in prison as a socialist because of his opposition to the First World War, and he was a several-time presidential candidate for the Socialist Party. But in the next quote along that same line, 2 years later by Clarence Darrow, when he was in court defending some members of the Communist Labor Party who were on trial for charges for advocating the forceful overthrow of the government, he said in court, you can only protect your liberties in this world by protecting the other man's freedom. You can only be free if I am free. So it's a similar sentiment from that same idea of and perhaps that was in the context of free speech or free advocacy for political ideals. I don't know what the specific freedom is he was addressing in that, but it's the idea that everybody in the society has to be accorded the same freedoms.
Well, as we've
realm.
seen in America here, if the people who were not free had not risen up against the discrimination, we would have continued to. I mean, I'm not wording this correctly, because white America would not recognize the injustices. Our so-called freedom was threatened by the uprising of the people who wanted justice also.
Well,
So-
that's a perspective of our freedoms will be threatened if we don't give the others freedom, as opposed
Right.
to the concept that we aren't truly free unless all are free.
Okay, explain that to me, because I
Well,
see it strictly as in the practical sense, which is odd
Yeah.
for me.
Well,
Usually I'm way out there, Mr. Idealistic, but
yeah, I'm not sure that I fully understand where the person's coming from who says this. It's kind of like a sense that in our shared humanity, it's kind of like the animal rights thing we were talking about last week with sentient beings shouldn't be subjected to suffering, and as long as any are suffering, we're not living up to our responsibilities as a sentient being.
and I'm thinking too, we're not free of our conscience if we're the ones that are free, and yet we're holding back some other segment of society. As I recall, in the books I read about slavery, there were a lot of slave owners who had to engage in some serious mental distortions to ease their consciences, for what they were doing, and that was mentally sick. It was damaging to them and their psyche, I guess, because of that, and it was precisely because they knew at some level that what they were doing was wrong, but they couldn't break themselves from it. So I guess in that regard.
Yeah, there are a number of different angles the person could look at this general theme of all must be free for any to be free. Here's another one. It's not related to slavery, but this is quoting Nelson Mandela. While poverty persists, there is no true freedom.
That kind of goes to one of the four freedoms that FDR mentioned in his State of the Union address in 1941.
Mm-hmm.
The four freedoms he mentioned were, and I'd like to talk about all four of these actually: freedom of speech and expression, freedom of every person to worship God in his own way, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. But you bring up what Nelson Mandela said: as long as there is poverty, there is not freedom, or something to that effect, right?
Yeah, while poverty persists, there is no true freedom. And that's the freedom from want, as I understand.
Yeah, that's what I was
from
thinking
what you were
too.
just
Right, yeah.
reading.
And that's something that took me a long time to realize. Back when I was a right-wing nut job, I just figured if I was earning my keep, that's all that was expected of me, and I couldn't see the point in helping people who couldn't make a living or whatever. And I guess, but it's, to me, that's it. Now I understand that's more than a social contract, really. Or is it? I mean, I hate to see anybody suffering, so I'll try to help them out when I encounter them. But if I don't ever encounter them, I don't know about it to help them. But it goes deeper than that.
Yeah, I think that's different from the social contract notion. I think it's more of a social justice notion.
Social justice, social contract.
It was,
I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I have.
For me, the way I think of a social contract is like what the rules are, and social justice is more like what's fair.
Okay.
The rules don't necessarily always correspond with what's fair.
No, but interestingly, the way you worded that, I would say that they were both one and the same. What I'm thinking is, any one of us could fall on hard times for whatever reason. And if I'm in this community and I see somebody else who falls on hard times, I would help them. I would see it as my human obligation to help them out. But the practical aspect of that is that I will help them out because I expect the community to help me out if I end up in a problem. Mm-hmm. It's kind of a valuable tradition to have, Mm-hmm. Also, I see from a practical point of view is that there are a lot of people who are doing jobs that are needed to be performed for me to have the high-paying job that I have. So it's in my interest to make sure those people have enough. Mm-hmm. And so, I guess that's where the argument for free health care or, government-funded health care or single-payer health care comes in, and minimum wages and things like that. But what about freedom of speech, Lang?
Yeah.
FDR, what is freedom of speech? I don't happen to agree that freedom of speech is universal. I think that's ridiculous, to be honest with you. But let's explore that if we could. Hopefully you disagree.
Yeah, well, I would say it probably comes down to what you mean by speech. I mean, the Supreme Court has said, that freedom of speech doesn't include shouting fire in a crowded theater when there's no fire there.
Okay.
On the other hand, they say obscenity is not entitled to protection under the freedom of speech clause.
But they couldn't define obscenity, though.
But they know it when they see it.
Yeah.
So.
Right. Yes.
And then there's the evolving standards of decency part of the test for what's obscene. So
Yes.
what's obscene in our century isn't the same as what was obscene last century or the century before that, or
Good point.
and
Yes.
you go back far enough, it's probably different and more freedom of expression than today.
Okay, I got an example, but I want to remind the listeners that you're listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker here on A Pause for Thought. We're discussing freedom, specifically freedom of speech, and how much speech are we free to express. 343-9927 is the number to call. 343-9927. We'd like to know what you think about that. And Lang, what I'm thinking of regarding freedom of speech is, I think it was Westboro Baptist Church would send protesters to the cemeteries where soldiers who were gay or something like that, the corpse, how do I say that accurately? The person who had died had been gay or whatever, and they would stand within earshot of the mourners and scream homophobic insults at them. And I was repulsed by that, and I thought there should be local ordinances allowing these people to be hauled away. And I had several local conservatives here tell me, no, that would be a violation of free speech, and I'd be afraid to go down that slippery slope. What's your take on that? Does somebody have the right to stand, outside of a cemetery and scream within earshot of you and insult the person, the loved one that you're lowering into the grave? Well,
if we're going on the social contract theory, it would be according to what the standards of that society are as regards respectful behavior for.
So you come in my community, you go by my
situation.
rules, right?
That
Okay.
that would be one way to approach it. Another more restrictive way would be to say, well, what's the purpose of free speech? Are we talking about free speech for artistic expression, for exploration of ideas, for intellectual debate, for scientific investigation?
Well, presumably these
Galileo
people...
was forbidden,
Yeah.
to speak out on his theories, and Kepler had his hidden away or not published until after his death because of the threats to free speech.
Right.
So there's those kinds of justifications of free speech in the terms of our intellectual pursuits.
Okay, so
in the rational part of the human thought process, brain processing, whatever you want to call it.
right, and within the context of the social contract.
So then, with the social contract, well, what is the free speech that's expected or respected under that social understanding of what's free speech encompasses?
I was going from the other direction. What rights does the community have according to their social construct? And I would say they have the right to mourn their dead in peace without the harassment of people standing off to the side screaming at them.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that would be the right that would be violated by the social norms there. Maybe that's it, Lang. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, then the flip side is, well, what if the people critical of those who were doing that protesting showed up at their church services and started shouting insults at them?
Good point.
Would they recognize that free speech in opposition to their exercise of their free speech?
Right, and they would have to if they wanted to be consistent. Correct. Of course, that right there would be a slippery slope, but yeah, and the thought I was going to bring up a moment ago just evaporated, so we'll just move on.
Okay.
The one thing here that kind of bothered me within the four freedoms that FDR mentioned was freedom of every person to worship God in his own way. He didn't say anything about not worshiping any God. And so, I mean, maybe I'm nitpicking there, but that seemed like a significant omission.
Yeah.
Especially in today's day and age.
If
you know,
you're going to talk
America.
freedom of conscience,
Yeah. Yeah, and okay, but I don't want to push that around too much, though. But then freedom from fear is another one that got me to wondering. If we talk about rights and everybody having them, should a person be allowed to manufacture deadly poisons in his backyard workshop or manufacture powerful explosives? You know,
well, to broaden that out, what are the limits of the the criminal law of what you can criminalize? Because those kinds of things are prohibited acts under criminal statutes.
okay, but why?
So,
Why? What?
well, that's what I'm saying. If you're going to talk about liberty versus freedom, I mean, one of the distinctions drawn there by John Stuart Mill, I believe, as you were reading, was the idea of freedom is that you can do any of that stuff. But liberty means that you've got to respect the rights of others.
Right. So what
And
right? What right do I have that would prevent somebody across the street from me or next door to me from making bombs?
Well, you can, I guess, get into the area of what kind of risk one person's allowed to expose other people to.
Okay, and I think I have a right to some degree of assurance that I'm not going to be blown up by the foolishness of one of my neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
And so, therefore, and that's probably the reason why government regulations tend to say if you want to build bombs, you need to have our approval and meet certain conditions, as well as have insurance and blah, 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 and do it in a place that's far removed from anybody who might be innocently harmed.
Yeah, there are laws that are based on the idea of protection from risk rather than the actual harm that
But would
the
you
act
say
would
that?
cause. For
would you-
instance, driving while intoxicated, that doesn't in itself cause a harm, but it poses a risk. And so
Yeah.
it's criminalized on the idea of protecting from risk.
Well, yeah, and it's not criminalized so much as it is a civil infraction, so to speak. Maybe I'm splitting hairs here, but you're not allowed to do it, of course.
You can
And
go
if
to
you
jail for it.
Sure, yeah,
Multiple convictions, you can go to jail for a long time for it.
and that's interesting too, though, Lang. Well, yeah, multiple convictions, you can go to jail for a long time if you can't afford to pay the fines. Otherwise, they'll just keep letting you out and do it and pay the fine. But I'm being cynical, but well, there's the civil law and then there's criminal law. Could there be a distinction in there as far as rights and risks? I wonder,
Generally speaking, criminal law is regarded as an offense against the society or the state or whatever that particular jurisdiction chooses to call the broader societal interests as being protected, whereas civil law is for a wrong done to you individually by whoever it is that you're filing your suit against.
I thought it would be the opposite. If you commit theft, you have stolen from a person and violated their right.
Yes, and you've also offended against the state's or interest in an orderly society that prohibits that kind of conduct. And that's
Okay.
why the state can send you to jail and you can be sued by the person you stole property from.
Okay,
So you
but
have
then
a civil suit and a criminal suit coming out of that.
the civil suit, you're simply, if you're driving drunk, you're putting people at risk.
There's no civil suit. You can't sue your neighbor because your neighbor drove down
But
the
you're
street
punished.
drunk.
But you're punished
But
for it by the
you're
state.
punished by the state because it's criminal.
It's criminal.
Mm.
Okay, so but armed robbery is
It's
civil.
criminal.
It is. Yeah, it's got to be criminal also.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well.
And you can be sued by anybody who is injured in the commission of the armed robbery by a civil suit, in addition to the state bringing a criminal
Right.
charge against you.
Okay, and that brings up a question I have, and maybe you know this, maybe you don't. Although you have had some exposure to the law in your previous life.
Yeah.
If somebody shoots me and I survive, and I decide I'm not going to press charges, will the government press charges against that person anyway? I've often wondered that.
Generally speaking, in this country and in the states in this country, you don't have a choice. That's up to the prosecutor whether they bring the criminal
Okay.
charges. There are places I couldn't tell you which countries off the top of my head, but it's where it is up to the individual. And it used to be that way, I believe, centuries ago in England, that you had an individual prosecutor to prosecute those cases.
And that must be an instance where the needs of society trump the individual in a different direction, I guess. Like, say, if I want to be forgiving and allow this person to get away with shooting me, society might think otherwise, and so
Yeah.
they take that into their...
You could request that the charges be dismissed, but the prosecutor has the ultimate say in whether or not to.
Yeah, and I guess it's the argument where if they get away with this one, they might do it again or whatever. I don't, I'm just curious. That was just something I was curious about there. One of the other things I've read was that freedom looks different for everyone. How would you talk about that?
Well,
I know it did look different to me than just about everybody
Yeah,
else in the
there-
world back when I was a right-winger.
I guess there's lots of ways it could look different to different people. One would be whatever your philosophical outlook on life is, or what you consider to be, the standards for what rights should be recognized. I mean, there are people who say that who argue against Roe v. Wade, saying that that violates the rights of the unborn, and then there are people who say that prohibiting abortion violates the rights of the woman to
Right.
control her own body. So there's that's an example of how the view of what the rights are differ according to an individual's perspective.
I would
and then
think-
there's whole cultural differences too as to what's just
Right.
and what rights people have.
But on the abortion thing, I would suggest that it's not so much an argument over rights as an argument over what is a human being.
Well, that's what they based it on. That's what
Right,
one
Roe v.
side
Wade,
bases
yes.
it on, but that's what it comes down to.
Yeah, I think the
Who
23
who
weeks.
has rights?
Right. Yeah, and that we don't need to get into that too much.
But then there's also in what age people are recognized to have certain rights that varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. What age does a person have a right to vote? What or even what gender does a person have a right to drive a car?
Right, drive a car, go to war, run for president.
Yeah.
You have to be,
Yeah.
35 years old to run for president or to get elected president.
But so there's lots of ways in which.
Okay, but getting back to freedom,
Mhm.
what about freedom from our genetics? Are we are we ever free at all? I mean, how free really are we? In any respect. I mean, are we not kind of trapped by our own biology?
There's a perspective that says you're only free to the extent you're aware of
Limitations?
what the limitations might be.
Okay, so if I never aspire to anything that would exceed any kind of limit, then as far as I know, I'm free.
Yeah, if you aren't aware of the cage you're in, you're free.
Okay, well,
To take it more generally.
yeah.
To the extent that you can exercise all the choices you want and make the decisions you want and have the outcomes or behaviors that you choose, as long as those aren't limited, you sense yourself as being free, I would guess.
Okay.
And when you come up against frustration, when you can't achieve what you want, then you feel some limitation of your freedom to do what you want. And whether that limitation is physical, genetic, social, the laws of the land, whatever the limitation is, there you come up against a barrier to what your freedom is.
Yeah, and
That's one way of looking at it.
And I'm wondering if maybe just becoming accustomed to the reality or the fact that we all are limited to some extent by something might lead to a more civil society and maybe less extremism in the name of liberty, although I do believe Thomas Jefferson was the one that said extremism in the name of liberty is a virtue, or
Barry
Goldwater. Okay, yeah, well, almost the same.
Yeah. But yeah, when you become aware, I guess it would be if you become aware of certain restrictions on your liberty, then to what degree do you accept that, and to what degree do you see that as unjust, and to what degree can you come up with a strategy or an organizing strategy or an individual strategy to remove that impediment to the exercise of your freedom.
Right, and one thing that might be a good idea is to teach civics again in school and remind people that restrictions on our freedoms are made in exchange for something else, which is the betterment and the support of our community and everything else. I mean,
some restrictions are,
yeah.
Some restrictions aren't. Slavery was,
no, slavery was not, of course.
Was a restriction on freedom for the benefit of slaveholders.
Right, but as far as driving drunk on the roads or building bombs in your workshop, we recognize that, we wouldn't want other people doing that around us, so we allow some constraints on those sorts of things. Well, Lang, we got to go. We're out of time.
That was fast.
Yeah. Anyway, you've been listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker bantering about freedom and what limits can be placed upon it. This is a pause for thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio, 96.9 FM here in Baton Rouge. We got to go. You have a good night.